That's me in the chair there, on my first day of elementary school. My teacher was Mrs. May, who looked something like Rudy Giuliani with old lady hair. She taught us a lot about the alphabet and colors and shapes. In fact, I sat at the orange square table. One day our class was drawing cards for a sick classmate. Fish happened to be the relevant animal at the time, so we all had fish in the front of our cards. I was already ahead of the drawing curve. My people had advanced past the potatoes with stick legs stage into differentiated necks complete with pants. But today was different. I completed my card and my classmate, Jason Strong, stood up to show Mrs. May his card. She promptly turned the card to the rest of the class, informing us of Jason's successful fish picture. Jason had drawn his fish under the water. I hadn't thought of this. I looked at my fish floating precariously above his watery habitat. Why hadn't I thought of this? Fish do live under the water. Mrs. May taught me a great deal about reality that day. Mrs. Flegger was my only elementary school teacher to encourage me artistically. She got me hooked on illustrations by Eric Carle and gave our class many crafts to draw and build. One day, Mrs. Flegger let me give the class a drawing lesson. I taught them how to draw a cat reaching into a fishbowl, complete with fish and water. One day, we all made turkey puppets for Thanksgiving. Mrs. Flegger stepped out of the room to answer the phone in the hallway, and we all started gobbling with our turkeys. She was very upset at the commotion. When she sat back down, she started calling on each of us, asking us if we had participated in this gobble fest, making each kid pull his or her card to warning if they had. When I was asked if I was a culprit in this conspiracy, I answered, yes. She said, "Thank you, Alan. Go have a seat." I went back to my seat without pulling my card to warning. I was the object lesson that day for being honest. I learned a great deal about thanks that day. Mr. Berg's name was Tim. We would always yell, "Tim Berg!" when he would walk in the room, much to his lack of amusement. He was a very scary man, standing in at 6'6" with a mustache. He was not a man to be pushed over. There were rumors of him holding kids by their ankles and shaking them up and down for being bad. But I was a good kid back then and was never held upside down. But one day Mr. Berg caught me picking my nose. Up until that point, I always thought I was invisible when I did that. Looking into my soul, he said, "Don't do that." That was all that was said about the incident, and that was the last time I picked my nose in class. I have a respect for Mr. Berg for not making me the object lesson of the day in front of my classmates. I learned a great deal about social poise that day. Third grade was pretty forgettable. My teacher was Mrs. Haroon, who became Mrs. Osborne when she got remarried. One day, class was almost over, and my classmates were being rowdy. I had a question, so I raised my hand to ask, but went unnoticed by the distracted Mrs. Haroon. I raised my hand again, this time saying her name aloud. She glanced over at me, and in a furious rage, she told me to go pull a card, which was the social equivalent to walking to the chopping block. The class let out a ooh, because I never pulled cards. In fact, I only pulled 2 cards in my elementary school history. I learned a great deal about injustice that day. I hated the 4th grade. Mrs. Skinner was a lady who often got labeled with being evil, and while I didn't start this notion, I certainly endorsed it. One day after the shooting at Columbine High School happened, Mrs. Skinner decided to inform us about the likelihood of that happening to us. My mortality was not something that came to my mind frequently, not because I avoided it, but because I was 10. I don't remember her story completely, but it ended with her informing us that we would be lying in pools of blood, which in all honesty is a horrible way to end a story, and certainly a way to make 10-year-olds dwell on their own hypothetical deaths. I learned a great deal about the fragility of life that day, not to mention how not to tell stories. Mr. Johnston was my hero. He introduced me to the concept of school being interesting and fun at the same time. Mr. J was a kid at heart and became my first teacher friend. My brother Garrett was 1 year older than me, so I had almost every teacher he had and frequently got called Garrett's brother or Marsala number 2. But now I was in 5th grade and independent of my brother's shadow since he was in middle school now. But one day in class, Mr. J accidentally called me by my brother's name. He corrected himself, but I'd already started thinking about my identity as a human being. Was I an individual or a mere shadow of my older brother? I learned a lot about what it meant to be Alan that day.